Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Royal Blue podcast as we reflect on yet another eventful week at Goodison Park, and we preview Everton's home game with Wolverhampton Wanderers tomorrow. I'm your host, Chris Beesley, joined by our regular guest, Everton statistician, and I'm told we should call him the Goodison guru these days, Gavin Buckland. And over at Echo Towers, we've got Conor O'Neill and Matt Jones as well. We will actually start with a bit of football today, actually. A bit of breaking news. Mason Holgate on his way down to Southampton to complete a season-long loan move. Actually, if I start with you, Gav, I mean, what are your thoughts on that one? Is a player for at one point, not in a too distant past, who's actually being linked with big money moves to Manchester City, and here he is heading out the Premier League, albeit on a temporary basis.
Yeah, Holgate's a classic case of how players, fans regard the player as changed dramatically, hasn't it, really? I actually recall when he signed his new contract, was it 2020, was it, I think?
During lockdown, around that time.
If you have a look at the comments about supporters, this is great news, future Everton captain, and all that type of stuff. Future of the club, and there was rumours of Man City coming in for him. And 3 years later, for a lot of different reasons, people are saying, why are we paying him 70 grand a week? It's rubbish, you can't, and there's reason for that, why it's changed. And I know that. And it just shows how a player's reputation with supporters can move over time. And I think, I don't know how much of his wages Southampton are paying, whether it's all or half or whatever, but good move for the player. He probably needs to rebuild his career a little bit. The only thing is, it gives us one less option in the sense of defence, which I suspect you may want to talk about today. But it's a sensible move.
Yeah, Conor, your thoughts on Mason Holgate? And maybe it's a bit harsh to say where did it all go wrong, but he's dropping down into the Championship there, isn't he?
I think it was an inevitable transfer in the end, wasn't it? I think it became quite clear early on this summer that he wasn't in Sean Dyche's immediate thinking for the new season. Obviously, last season, he come in towards the end, but I think it's safe to say he enjoyed a torrid few weeks. Obviously, the sending off at Crystal Palace, and obviously he suffered a tough afternoon against Manchester City at Goodison towards the back end of the season. So I think this transfer always felt somewhat inevitable. I think it's quite damning, isn't it, that he only dropped down to the Championship. I know Southampton are keen to get back up at the first opportunity, but you perhaps would have thought a Premier League club would have been maybe looking at one of the new boys. I know Sheffield United were interested in him, but one of the big stumbling blocks there was his wages and how much he earned, and even the prospect of paying 50% of his wages was still a massive ask for a club like Sheffield United. But it's a sad kind of state of affairs, isn't it, which sum up Everton in the sense of, like Gav said there, when he signed that new contract a couple of years ago, there was a lot of optimism, a lot of high hope for Holgate, and yet he's just not really fulfilled his potential. And if anything, when we look back now, you kind of get the feeling that unless something major happens or there's a massive U-turn or transformation, it's going to be a massive case of what if when it comes to Mason Holgate and Everton. And this transfer, like I say, felt inevitable, but there's somewhat of I think he's bored kind of the backlash, hasn't he, of all the managers as well. I think it's tough, isn't it, when you for any player, when your club has had so many managers in a short space of time. I mean, how many managers have they had since, is it 3 in the time since or 4 in the time since he signed that new contract, if we include caretakers. So it's not, it felt inevitable, but I think it's a damning indictment of the position and the chaos of Everton over the last few years. Yeah,
Matt, is any concern for you? Because I know you've obviously gone on record and saying you're a bit worried about the centre-back options that Everton have got with Mason Holgate going out the door?
Yeah, I think it's understandable, isn't it? It's been obvious for a while. He's not really fancied by Sean Dyche. I think he played quite a lot under Lampard and maybe sort of went under the radar a little bit. And he always seemed to try and find a way of getting him in the team. But yeah, I think he's ultimately, like both the lads have sort of said, he's a victim of the instability at Everton. I think if you look back to when Carlo Ancelotti came in, I think it was that first half a season under Ancelotti where he really kicked on, wasn't he? I remember the game when we beat Watford 3-2 away from home. I remember Mina scored 2 goals that day, but I remember a lot of people afterwards were talking about Holgate and how good he was when Everton had 10 men in the second half and had to soak up a lot of pressure. then he picked up an injury at the end of that season, didn't he? And was out for the start of the next campaign. And when he came back, he just never quite was able to realise that form. And perhaps it's another indication, and I'm sure we'll go and talk about a bit later, as Gav said, that when he was playing next to Yerry Mina, he looked quite good and quite accomplished. So maybe there's a common theme here with a lot of the centre backs that Everton still got at the club, that when Mina's there and they're playing next to him, they look instantly a better player. And yeah, it's one of them, isn't it? It's another example of how form ultimately colours our opinions of a player, because the same things that he's getting criticised for at times now in regards to his attitude and his spikiness and that kind of thing are things that people that made him want to be captain a few years ago. So it's just not worked out for him. I think the move's good. Hopefully, given Southampton have recouped quite a lot in terms of transfer fees in recent weeks. Everton have got a good deal in terms of his wages, because he is in one of our top earners ultimately, I think, isn't he? But yeah, I don't really look back at that contract decision and say, and put it with all the other terrible decisions Everton have made in regards to recruitment in recent years. I think at the time it felt like the right thing to do, and it's just not worked out, this one.
Yeah. And then moving to the big off the field news this week, it will start with you, Gav. The MSP Sports Capital, a deal with them had been proposed at the period of exclusivity. Throughout the summer, there was hope that they would obtain a 25% stake in the club that could have been worth 150 million. That deal is collapsed, but they're still proceeding with a £100 million loan to the stadium company. I mean, it seemed a big shock at the time, but is there a possibility, Gav, that people have perhaps over-egged this and what it actually means for Everton?
Yeah, it depends what we need in the short term and the long term. In the short term, we need cash, don't we? And they're giving us 100 million as a loan. So that fills some of the shortfall on the stadium funding, while another deal is done for the remaining balance, which is 250 million or whatever it is after that 100 million is received. So that's the main thing that comes out of it. I get the frustration over the MSP. The other aspects of the deal in terms of having two members on the board and having a little bit more of access to other expertise and possible funders. I get that, but in the short term, we are getting 100 million. So it's not all bad news as such. If we're getting 100 million, that would be a different kettle of fish. So it's not the end of the world. It's not great, and it's another example of like a news story that can be used to batter the club over the head with. I'm not so sure about that, but the mystifying thing for me though is what. I mean, it's been well known for 2.5 months that MSP were going to be lending money. We had that in documents produced in the United States. That was early June. What puzzles me is why this has suddenly only just become an issue now, or a public issue now, when it's been known for a couple of months. I can only assume that the delay in getting the MSP funding is because Everton have been talking to rights and media funding in that time, to try and resolve the issue, and I've not been able to do so, and in the end, I've had to pull the plug over the entire MSP deal, which in many respects, and it goes back to why clubs are silent. If that's the case, if they have been talking to rights and media funding, that explains the club's silence, doesn't it? Because they can't talk about that in public, can they? Because it's a commercial issue, isn't it? And so when people say, the club's not said anything updates about the MSP deal and all this, that's because there's probably commercial discussions going on in the background that we're not privy to, that the club can't disclose. And that's the only conclusion I draw from it. But I'm getting 100 million is in the short term is good. But there is these longer term issues that the uncertainty is not great, and hopefully will resolve themselves in terms of get other people on board who are legitimate, and hopefully that can be done sooner rather than quicker. What it does for the board, which was an interim board based on the assumption the MSP deal would be coming through, and they'd have two people on the board and we could restructure. What happens to the interim board now? I don't know.
Yeah.
Especially with Mashiri's still on it.
Yeah, like I said, they are. It is an interim board, as Gav says. I mean, Connor, you were in the Everton hot seat in the Everton reporting capacity when that news broke on Wednesday night. Obviously, I know the club subsequently released a statement, but it's kind of. I mean, there've been rumblings in the days up to that, but it still came as a big surprise when the news did drop at that point.
Yeah, I think it was a surprise. I think it, obviously caused a bit of a frenzy on social media, which news like that tends to these days. I think a lot of people have kind of had the mindset of no news is good news when it being in terms of MSP, and it'll all come out once everything's been finalised and all the eyes are being boxed and stuff like that. But obviously that wasn't the case. I think what Gav says is spot on. I think in the short term, still getting 100 million quid towards the stadium, which I think is a massive boost and much needed boost. I think the long term now though is where it's interesting, because I think like Gav said, when you look at the board and the makeup of the board, it consists of 4 people at the minute, and many believed it was of that, because sooner rather than later MSP will formally get involved with the club and put at least 2 people on that board, and then decisions can be made then in terms of appointing a full-time proper chief executive, and adding more expertise to the board. That is obviously now not going to be the case. And what you suspect now that there probably will be more of an interim board moving forward, because if Farhad Moshiri is in conversations, which we believe he is, but other investors and other kinds of avenues, then he's not going to be employing anyone anytime soon to take permanent capacities, because obviously once you do that limits who you could bring in, because they might want to say in terms of who's the chief executive and who's the finance director and stuff like that. So I think short term, at least Everton know that they've got the money, and they know that they've secured much needed funding for the new ground. But I think long term now, there's a lot of questions that need answering, and I think Gav says the most important thing is that some sort of swift solution is found, because as Sean Dyche likes to say himself, stuff like this brings a lot of noise around the football club, doesn't it? And I think there's already enough noise around the football club as things stand, and this just adds to that, doesn't it? More than anything, this just adds to that noise, and it adds to the concerns that fans have rightly got in terms of where the club is and where the club's heading. Not helped obviously by the fact that the team so far have not performed on the pitch, but certainly off it, there's a lot of questions that I think need answering moving forward, and what the strategy is, because it felt like for large parts of this, there would be a clear strategy and a clear vision kind of implemented and explained moving forward once MSP officially got involved with the football club. That's not going to happen. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting few months ahead, I think, in terms of what Everton do next and where Everton turn to. But at least the positive in the short term is that they've secured that much needed funding to keep the stadium build on track and on schedule.
Yeah, Matt, as Gavin kind of mentioned there, it is only an interim board in there in terms of personnel at the moment. This was a deal that I think both parties were briefing that they were expecting to get completed. So Gav's question there about why this didn't come up earlier, that the hump in the road, perhaps they were feeling they could resolve it. But yeah, it's another deal that Mr. Moshiri's been unable to complete, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I understand what Gavin and Connor are saying, and it just feels like more of the same for me in that sense, because I sort of look at Everton in 2 different ways at the moment, in the sense that everything that's going on with the stadium, the way it's the way it looks, all the prep that was done beforehand has been really good, and the fact that they've secured this £100 million loan in regards to the stadium is really good. But it's the other stuff, the investments in the football club that would help with cash flow, that would help with transfers, etc., etc. The day-to-day sort of running, bringing in players that I think there was the big appeal about MSP for me, and not only that, but the expertise they would potentially bring in with them as well into the football club. Because as you mentioned, the board at the moment is a temporary one. And to be honest, when the news came through, it was a bit of a punch in the gut for me, really, because I think we went into this summer again, like last one, looking at it thinking, right, things have got to change now at every level of the football club, otherwise we're going to be in the same situation that we're in again. And I appreciate that a few people have left the board, and there's been a few changes, you said there, in regards to Colin Chong, Moshiri's on the board, etc., etc. But we're going to be looking at a situation now where Everton are going into already in a new season with the same people largely at the top of the football club making decisions that who have made bad decision after bad decision for a long time now. I was at Villa on Sunday, and there's only one new face in the starting 11 for that game, and that was a 38-year-old utility fullback we signed on a free. So it just feels as though, already we're here. It's nearly September, and Everton have missed another great chance at a summer reset, both in terms of bringing in. I appreciate that the transfers, a few of them are injured. One of them in Chimiti isn't ready yet, according to Dyche. But off the pitch, it feels like we're just going to kick this can down the road again. It was only a few months ago we had a situation where it looked like Bill Kenwright's exit was inevitable. And in the end, he ended up staying on the board in a temporary basis. And now it feels like he's going to be here for even longer. So it just feels more and more like back to what we were going to be getting with, and that's the club sort of making decisions on the hoof, not being able to make proper long-term plans, and that just all feeds into this. I know Sean Dyche sort of dismissed this idea of a crisis club so early into the season, but it does feed into that narrative, and I'm not surprised fans are feeling like this, because every time it feels like the club are trying to make a step forward, something happens, be it their own fault, be it something going elsewhere, that seems to hamper that progress. It was just hugely disappointing for me, because I think it doesn't help Everton from a financial sense immediately, and I don't know what that means for transfers for the rest of this window. I know you reported today, Chris, the showdown deal now is looking probably unlikely to happen at this stage. So what does the that money they would have potentially set aside for transfers, does that impact us there? And it's the expertise as well, off the pitch. It doesn't appear like there's going to be much new blood, new ideas, new ingenuity, freshness being brought into that boardroom either. And it feels like that's sort of the same for the football club at the moment.
I think that's the problem. So just to cut in, but that's the problem, isn't it? Because with MSP, you felt like they were a safe pair of hands in many respects, because they had a background in sports management, investments, and they seemed a real reputable company who were well regarded and well respected within the investment circles and stuff like that. And the investments that they made in companies, you could see the benefits of and stuff like that. The worry now, I think, is that fans feel that Everton could end up with anyone getting involved. Someone not of a respectable nature, and someone of perhaps, who's just taking a chance because they can see perhaps, how desperate Everton might end up being in terms of needing investment. I think that's the worry more than anything, is that it feels like Everton have missed out on getting the perfect company in, or the perfect investment company in to help them, move forward and reshape and start doing things differently. I think that's the big worry for fans, and understandably so, because, like I say, I know our football finance reports take part in a lot in terms of like how well respected and well regarded MSP were in business circles. So the fact that Everton have lost out on that expertise and getting them on board, I think is a massive blow for a lot of supporters.
Yeah. Just my understanding is the MSP money is only ever intended for the stadium, not intended on helping the team out. I think it was 140 million. 40 million was to pay back Andy Bell, and 100 million for the stadium. So I don't think it would have affected transfers as such in terms of giving extra money for the club. What it does, though, I think, though, is you'd like to think that now we can possibly spend a little bit more money in the last. I'm not sure. I'm being really optimistic here. It helps us in terms of what we can spend in the last week of the season, because we know we've got the 100 million towards the stadium, rather than some of the stuff that we've set aside for transfers might have been diverted there towards the stadium if MSP hadn't stepped in. So it's a bit of both, really, in different ways. But I agree with what the lads are saying. I think that having that expertise would have been really valuable on, at board level for us, and we've just got to see what happens now going forward, because, as Matt said, it's just more uncertainty, and it's every time we look as though we get to resolving an issue, it gets pushed down the road again, doesn't it? And I share everybody's frustration on that.
I think the issue with transfers as well is that Everton are still working in constraints, aren't they, in terms of FFP, which is a big issue. So sometimes there's that kind of feeling of, even if Everton had a pot of gold, which Sean Dyche quite bluntly said that they don't yesterday in his press conference, that they still wouldn't be able to bring people in because they're still working with a threshold because of the 4 or 5 years of reckless spending which they had. So, in terms of transfers, people were getting into the transfer around this, but I think even if Everton, got Sheikh Mansour in next week, they'd still be struggling to to spend large amounts of money because of what they've spent before has come back to home, basically.
That's anywhere though, isn't it? It's like Saudis and Newcastle, isn't it? You've got the richest country per head in the world or whatever it is, but they can only spend so much because of the financial constraints within football, isn't it? Really?
Same now, aren't you? You know, tomorrow's opposition. You know, they're really hamstruck in terms of what they can do, because you know they've gone from not being able to sign free agents and stuff to now they're basically signing no one because their wage bill and stuff is so tight to where the thin line around FFP is that they can't, or they don't want to take the risk to sign.
Yeah. It's my understanding. Like you say, you could have the Saudis come into Everton, like you say, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't spend that at the moment because of those financial constraints. So yeah, you're both right there. That's the reality of the situation at the moment. We move on to back onto on-field events. Connor, as you mentioned there, you were at Sean Dyche's pre-match press conference yesterday ahead of the Wolves game. I mean, what kind of form did you find the gaffer in?
Well, he was his normal cheery self in the open session, you know. He passed away a few questions like an Australian batsman down at the Gabba. He was. I think he one of the press conferences yesterday with Sean Dyche where you felt a little bit sorry for him because he's answering questions that he probably has no real insight into in terms of MSP and financial, the regulation on transfers and stuff like that. And I know people are loath to feel sorry for people in football because they always look at the wages that they earn and think, well, how can you feel sorry for anyone who's on X amount a week? But it was one of them yesterday where you kind of sitting there thinking, well, actually, really, someone much higher up should be sitting in that chair answering these questions, not Sean Dyche, because what does he really know about the MSP deal? He wasn't in. I don't think he would have been in New York or London or wherever where this deal's been getting broke for the last couple of months. He'd probably been, just hearing bits and pieces as and when someone had an update for him. So in that sense, it was tough. I think it was the football side of things. He's obviously very defiant. He laughed off the suggestion that in the middle of a crisis. He said it's 2 games basically. And your season is defined by 2 games, and if anything, he said there's lots to be positive about in terms of the first performance against Fulham. I think the most worrying thing yesterday for me from the whole press conference was the injury latest, because what was already a threadbare squad for Everton all of a sudden looks a lot threadbare, and all of a sudden you're putting round pegs in square holes, or you're putting people in positions that they probably shouldn't be in. If we're being honest, for instance, with Alex Iwobi and Dwight McNeil both missing tomorrow, there's a chance Lewis Dobbin could start out wide. Now Lewis Dobbin's done well pre-season, don't get me wrong, but would you 6-7 weeks ago be saying, well, on the 3rd game of the season against Wolves that many people are now believe is a must win, you're going to play Lewis Dobbin out wide? They wouldn't be saying that. So that was the most interesting thing for me in yesterday's press conference, was the injury update, because it's certainly not getting any easier for Sean Dyche. I think he's each week he seems to have more and more casualties in the treatment room, and like I say, what was already a threadbare squad going into the season is already become even threadbare now, and I think that's a worry because Everton have got 3 big games before the next international break. If you include Wolves, Doncaster, and Sheffield United, and it feels like it's going to be a case of round pegs and square holes in a lot of departments. Yeah,
I mean, Gav, you were on a scouting mission to Molineux very recently, we believe. So you've got the inside track on Wolves. Your thoughts on this? I mean, some have described it as the earliest ever 6-pointer. We put them to rights because we mentioned obviously the trip to Crystal Palace back in 2004. Not far off, is it?
Do you want to know like a little bit of niche trivia? Apparently, the term 6-pointer or whatever, 4-pointer before the 3-pointer, the earliest known time it was used was by the Birmingham Evening Dispatch in 1939 about an Everton Wolves game. Would you believe? And I won't tell you the score.
What's the earliest one?
I suggest you look it up. But yeah, I saw Wolves last week. The defeat it was that bad that nobody would have predicted it, but we still ended up champions. But I saw Wolves I saw Wolves last week. Similar team to us, really. Not a lot up top. Struggling. I think, is it Silver? Is it the fellow who plays up front?
Yeah.
They're not much. They got weaknesses at the back. Aging central defence. You got Dawson playing there, and can play some decent stuff. But they scored. Was it less than us last season? Was it?
Yeah, they were the only ones, weren't they?
And you can last week you can see why. So the two clubs pretty much at the same place, I would imagine. And the benefit for us is the centre off, isn't it? What's his name? Nunes, yeah. He's by some distance one I saw last week, their best player. So yeah, I think it's a winnable game against Wolves. That said, Wolves played really well at Old Trafford, I believe. So it'd be interesting to see what happens tomorrow. But I think based on what I saw last week, they can be got at, as the phrase says. Unfortunately for us, we haven't got Matoma playing wide left, have we? Or Solly March playing. That's the difference. And Brighton, as you would expect, we're excellent.
Question to the Villa game for me, Gavin, in that sense, because I was watching Villa get levered by Newcastle, and then you're sort of rubbing your hands together, and you're like, oh wait, there we haven't got Isak. Exactly. And it's like that with this week. Wolves have looked vulnerable defensively, but as Connor rightly said there, we are so down to the bare bones. In the attack, arguably the options are even weaker than last season. And as you mentioned there already, we're already at a point where last season we were the second lowest scorers in the league. So I think if you're going to take any small positives from last week, which is very difficult. Then Dobbin and Danjuma were the two when Danjuma was full of running. Dobbin had flashes without really showing much in terms of end product. But it's like it feels like one of them where we're sitting here now saying it'd be great to see both of those lads on the pitch. But when it comes to 2:00 on Saturday, are we going to all slump in on the seats? I could easily see a situation where Neil Maupay starts again at the weekend, albeit we might not have much choice. And I also could see a situation where maybe Mikolenko comes in or Godfrey comes in a fullback and he pushes Ashley Young forward into one of the wide positions because we're so short as well. So it's really difficult. And as much as I'd love to sit here and go, Wolves conceded 4 at home last week, is right. Let's get at them. When you compare Matoma, Solly March, Ferguson, etc., to the options we've got, it's a big gulf, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're mentioning obviously those enforced absentees now. Calvert-Lewin's out, Iwobi's out. I mean, how would you fill those gaps, Gav? How do you see that one going? So we've just lost Gav there. Go to Connor.
Connor, you go first on that one.
Well, in terms of filling gaps, me and Matt were talking about this before in the office. Yeah. Obviously, for regular, people of the Royal Blue, Liverpool Everton readers will not read our own team selectors, popular on the website. We'd always get it right. is the big thing.
We're at a point where it's really hard to get wrong. We've got so few players,
well,
to be honest.
This is where to borrow. I think I'm going to curveball people, but I'll tell them how. I would start Tom Cannon.
Okay, yeah.
I would start Tom Cannon up top, just simply because it's something different. And I just think you're at the point now where just do something different. We're just, I know it's easy to say, but I'm just fed up of watching the same thing week in, week out. I know people will say we're only 3 weeks into the season, or we will be in 3 weeks into the season tomorrow. But the first 2 weeks have basically been what we saw for the second half of last season, haven't they, really? Nothing has really changed. I just think, you've got a young lad there who went to the Championship last season, scored goals, is clearly got something about him. Clearly, is chomping at the bit to prove himself at this level. So, put him in. I mean, I don't think Everton have got anything to... people will argue they've got a lot to lose, but I don't think they've got anything to lose by giving Tom Cannon a go tomorrow because, Neil Maupay, God bless him, had his chance against Fulham. I mean, if it's not going to happen that day, you start to think, well, when is it ever going to happen? Because 4 of the most simplest chances a Premier League team is going to ever get in a game, if we're being honest. So I would just do something different, I think, and give Tom Cannon a go from the start and just, see what happens. Because, like I say, I just think, Mope, I think it's just all too predictable now. I think we all know what's going to come. And I think people will be excited about Cannon playing. I think, it might not be fluid, but it'll be interesting and it'll be something different. And, we can gauge, I think, how far Tom Cannon is in his progress as well, because the big thing for me is with Tom Cannon, you don't know how far in his progress he is. But one of the interesting things I do think with Tom Cannon is, I would argue that it's harder to score 8 goals in half a season in the Championship than it is to score the 3 that Shemetti scores in the Portuguese League, the Sporting in the half of last season. So if we see Shemetti as someone for the future and someone who's going to ultimately work his way into Sean Dyche's squad on the back of scoring 3 goals in half a season in Portugal, then I certainly think Tom Cannon should be given a chance, given he scored 8 goals in half a season, 8 goals in 12 appearances, whatever it was, in half a season at Preston. So for me, I just think I'd do something different and start on Cannon. I think ultimately as well, you've got to start Danjuma. You've got to get him in the starting lineup because he looked dangerous against Villa. Okay, admittedly not beating them in the game as much as you can, but when he did get on the ball, he looks to make things happen. So for me, you've got to get Cannon and Danjuma in the starting lineup.
So some case of Cannon, I feel like I'm going to go out and get a Tom Cannon shirt now after that rallying cry. I feel like
he certainly fits the profile closer than a lot of the alternatives, don't they? I mean, the players they're being linked to now. Obviously, we know they've put the bid in for Che Adams and Beto as well. I mean, Cannon is sort of closer in their style than the other players who've been playing up top. I mean, your thoughts on that, Matt? And obviously, you've mentioned already. I think there's a strong chance actually that he might put maybe Mikolenko or even, like you say, Godfrey in at fullback and move Young up to the wide midfield area.
Yeah, I think that's what he will do. Although I'm not necessarily sure it's what I'll do. It feels like, if you get beat 4-0, away from home and you're playing a team that's lost both of their 2 home games, their 2 games so far at home, albeit, ignoring the fact that we have as well, then it feels like, the ground is like rife for like a few changes, doesn't it? And I don't know, people have been listening to this going and be screaming who's going to come in then, but I'm sure people are sick of hearing us talk about it, but Jared Branthwaite, surely the time is now after Michael Keane almost kicked 2 into his own net last week. Tom Cannon, as Connor mentioned there, if Dobbin plays on one of the wings, and listen, it might completely blow up in our face on Saturday, but that if some changes are made like that and there's some freshness and there's something different in the team, that anybody on the way to the ground, in the boozers around Goodison Park, in the ground already, you'd be keen to get in. When you get that team news through, you're going to be happier, aren't you? And the atmosphere is going to be better. It's not going to be turning up, seeing the same lads, turning the same performance, and ultimately the same sort of outcome. So it would be nice to see something refreshed. I mean, the thing I'm most excited about is to see how many goalkeepers we have on the bench on Saturday. Because, we have 2 on the bench with a fully fit squad already. But, without, could we get 4 on there, do you reckon?
Are they got 4 goalkeepers?
But in all seriousness, I think what he will do is he'll go Young left, Garner right, Danjuma up front with the core behind him. That, Idrissa Gueye and Nana, but I wouldn't be against Idrissa Gueye coming out. I think he's been poor in the first 2 games. I think Ashley Young's actually gone low-key under the radar, has struggled in both games so far as well. So maybe you could move him over to the right, or you could play Mikolenko instead of him as well. But at this point, I don't think the manager could make any change or bring any player out, and you could say, God, they've been outdone too, because Aston Villa, by and large, all of them stunk the gaff out. So they're all right for the chopping block, as far as I'm concerned. I
just think it's a case of do something different. Just try something different or do something different. Everyone's fed up with saying the same thing, aren't they, week on week? And like I think Matt says there, if he does do something different and there's a few curveballs in there, Brownfield gets in over Keane and Dobbin starts, and Tom Cannon, Sean listens to this podcast and puts Tom Cannon in.
He's not known as being the Tinker Man, is he? Though, to be fair,
no, we know we won't, don't we? But
this is all wishful thinking on our part, really. Yeah. But it's just you just want to see something different, don't you? Because I think we're 2 weeks into the season, just history feels like it's repeating itself, and I just think now there's nothing to lose, in doing something different because. Like Matt said there, how bad it was last week at Villa. Let's face it, probably with the exception of Pickford because he doesn't really have a backup. If any 10 outfield players got dropped tomorrow, you could not complain, could you? You could not. Even like James Tarkowski, a lot of folks on Michael Keane, but someone like James Tarkowski, being very good for Everton, wasn't great last week, was he? I think probably the lowest rate you probably ever give him, Chris. I think I'd suspect. So even if he come out, you couldn't argue and say, "Oh, that's a bit harsh," because he was, below par. So hopefully, see something different is my, big hope going into tomorrow. Who would you go for, Bees? Who would you go for?
I'd probably go with Dan Juma up front, and like what Matt said, I'd push Young into wide midfield with Mikalenko possibly at left back, but it's certainly, like I say, the centre back in terms of, if he's gonna, this is an opportunity. If he's going to change it around at centre back, this is the perfect opportunity for him to do that. And after, well, not just Keane. Obviously, Tarkowski was very much an off day for him, and it seems bad because both, two top lads. To be fair, we know they're both great pros, but there was poor from them both last week. So
I think it'll be interesting tomorrow as well to see what Damari Gray.
Oh yeah, got about
because I know I've been in talks with a club in Saudi over him going in. The president of that club was quite public and saying he was open to get him in, but obviously as we sit here now, he's still an Everton player. Whether he's maybe on his way there or whatnot, but if he's not and he's available, would you not just put him on the bench? For at least the last 10 minutes, to bring him on? Because it's just, for me, I understand that maybe Sean Dyche is not Damari Gray's biggest fan, but I just think he's an outlet. He's something different, and he's got the ability to do something else or nothing. Yeah, he's frustrating, but just have him on the bench for 10 minutes to go to bring him on. It's something different. It's a different dimension that could make a massive impact on the game.
Yeah, while he's at the club, you got to utilise him as an asset. So it's crunch time. It's Gary O'Neill's biggest trip to Goodison since the 28th of May. It's the as Gav tells us, it's the biggest Everton Wolves game since 1939, when there were even greater things on the horizon back then. But how's this one going to go, Connor? A prediction?
Well, I think Everton will just edge it 1-0. It'll be far from a classic, and if we're being honest, we'll all think, God, that was tough to watch. But I think we'll just edge it 1-0. I think the home being a home will be the big difference. I think that'll be the big. I think whoever would have been at home tomorrow would have had the advantage. So I think we'll just edge it 1-0. But I think it's going to be a tough 90 minutes to watch. I don't think it's going to be a high class Premier League fixture by any stretch of the imagination.
Matt, your predictions are often more entertaining than the matches themselves.
You're not going to like this one, then, because I'm going to say 0-0.
No shots on target to make the team.
It's just like, with that front four, like, unless we score a set piece, and I think our set piece has been pretty awful so far this season. Like, they were a real threat last year, but like, I don't know if opposition teams have got onto them, or we've just not had McNeil there. Maybe his method of delivery's been poor. He's been absolutely dreadful so far. So I just don't know where the goal is going to come from our point of view. And given that they were somehow worse in attack than we were last season, maybe their fans will be saying the same about them. So I'll say 0-0. Sorry, Bees. I've not got a mad scenario or anything today. I've not got the energy this week. Not got the energy this week to muster one up, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's a clean sheet. You've both gone for the clean sheet for the Blues there. I'll complete the hat trick there, and I'll go same as Connor. I'll say I'll be positive and say Everton to nick it 1-0 in the battle of the two lowest scoring sides in the Premier League last season, and the two teams who started with a brace of defeats this time. So onwards and upwards. We'll be back with you next week to review all that went on at Goodison Park, and obviously look forward, inverted commas, to that Carabao trip to Donny, and then obviously there's another Yorkshire return after that to Sheffield United. So the game's coming thick and fast, and of course we'll also have the close of the transfer window on the horizon by then. But for now, I've been your host, Chris Beesley. I've been joined belatedly by Gavin Buckland, Matt Jones, and Connor O'Neill. This has been the Royal Blue Podcast.